So, good morning, everyone. My name's Simon Barlow. I currently work for a company called Geoplace here in the UK, and I've been involved in dressing for a little over 20 years or so now. I've been involved largely in developing addressing systems, data standards, and the implementation of some national projects around addressing and street data management. So, what I'd like to cover today is really just to give you an outline on what the important aspects of unified addressing are, some aspects that are generally thought of as being important for a good addressing system, and some of the positive outcomes that an addressing system results in. And I guess I'd also cover some of the themes around implementation, that some tricks around and tips around how one can implement an addressing system. This is very much an introductory session rather than an in-depth view of addressing around the world, but hopefully you'll gather some thoughts and some ideas, and this may lead into future webinars that we can present. So let's get started with a bit of background and context. As we appreciate, addresses have existed since mankind has really formed settlements around the world. And really, they were the first form of navigational instructions, which still really have the same, I guess, critical use today. The image on the bottom right-hand side of the screen really shows the very first step-by-step navigation device. It's called the +4's route finder, and it was invented in the 1920s. And if you look at all the information displayed in it, it really does use the same kind of approach to conveying instructions around addressing and navigation as we use today in our cars or in our smartphone. And I noticed, interestingly, it looks a little bit like a similar design to an Apple iWatch. So maybe Steve Jobs and co have been looking at some history to get some ideas. Anyway, as we all know, it's quite difficult to interact with society without an addressing system of some kind. And most people working in the sort of the tech industries and the geospatial industries will realise that data models and IT systems that have been built to support addresses are very, very recent, and in comparison to addressing, and really not everything in the real world fits in these data models. So addressing systems can be quite complicated. But what I've really found is that good addressing makes a lot of things work well. And also that new types of addressing systems are emerging and presenting some opportunities for us all to think about addressing and look at new ways of implementing it. For most people, addresses in all variations have a personal connection, I think, and provide an identity which can define who they are based on local, maybe tribal or community values. For example, living in a certain city may, I guess, predispose you to supporting a certain football team or instill a sense of pride or ownership of local regional values compared to other locations. So addressing is kind of personal to many people. In the developed world, formal addressing systems were largely based on road names and property numbering, and they were developed out of a need to support things like urbanisation, industrialisation, commerce, and the need to plan and zone development around these kind of activities. Alongside this, most of us will know addresses are historically associated with sending and receiving letters and other mail items as part of the interactions we make between the state, business, and with other citizens. So in order for this to be as efficient as possible, postal operators in the main have instilled in us a methodology to think of addressing as locations in kind of hierarchies based on geography of regions, maybe place names, administrative areas at the highest level, right down to buildings at the other. So this context provides us with a useful framework for wayfinding and navigation both in the physical and digital worlds, which we now find ourselves in using both paper and digital maps. And I guess it's been one that's been universal to humans over time in navigation of the globe. In fact, it still forms probably the basis of much of our thinking on this topic and transcends all types of culture. So There are a few types of addressing systems currently in operation around the world, and all really seem to follow the basic premise described above around navigation. And all are probably used in every country to greater or lesser degrees. So geographic or administrative addressing systems, and I guess I could lump postal in here as well, are probably the easiest to understand and most prevalent. But simply, I guess they contextualize geographic place names and have been used by postal operators globally to ensure that mail can be delivered anywhere in the world to support the universal service obligations they have. Descriptive addresses and address systems are really, I think, more common than most people think they are, and usually include some elements of both geographic and postal address systems, really, in order to make them work. So in this category, this would be something like Simon's house near the large building with a red roof on the roundabout at the airport as a descriptive address. But also it could be those that I came across in parts of East Africa, which use mobile phone numbers alongside geographic information as a way of finding locations. In this example, the geographic address element would get you to the city or the suburb, and the delivery agent or the mail operator would then need to call the number to gain further instructions on how to find the recipient. And that would be a series of dialogues getting nearer and nearer to the end location. Hybrid systems are really those which I define as that are well integrated and have matched together disparate and often legacy systems through careful correlation of address attributes and use IDs to link across all these different systems. There are a number of cases where they've successfully linked postal, geographic, what we call vanity addresses, and descriptive elements. And they have often lots of metadata to allow users to decide on how the portrayal of their addresses can be achieved in the most appropriate address used in any kind of end solution. Digital is the area where there are emerging address solutions that are starting to disrupt the traditional systems we just talked about and offering alternatives, particularly with e-commerce platform providers and connected devices. Typically, the textual string is replaced by a unique code or a reference or string defined by or linked to a GPS coordinate, spatial reference, or perhaps an image. And then finally, physical addresses. These really relate to the signs, the names, and number plates that are erected on road signs and on properties. They've been around for decades or centuries and have been used to generate really all the above types of addressing content through survey activity and are now found in databases. I guess the original form of navigation is how you describe them and the precursor to what we've just been talking about. But as I talk through the rest of this webinar, I'll cover some of these types of systems and provide more information as we go along. So one question I'm often asked when I meet people, which is also useful for organisations to go away and think about when developing a strategy for addressing, is why do addresses need managing? Well, most people think that someone else is already doing this and they can then just use it for their own purpose. Quite often, yes, the truth is so. It is being done by someone else, but it's been done by many other people in their own ways to suit their own needs. So this is often the case in one organisation or government department, or sometimes wider, even at the national level, where there are different systems often competing. So usually an address list will suit one use case, and when someone else wants to use it in another application, they usually find gaps, errors, or information that does not match with their own view of the world, and therefore makes it difficult to use. So thinking differently, we should be proposing that having an enterprise-level strategy or national policy, perhaps, around address data management would generally result in better content, quality, and widen its use as a reference base for others. So addresses, in my view, really need to be viewed as a data asset in both the public and private sectors, as without this kind of accurate location data about citizens and customers, types of services we want to deliver can be inefficient or really have quite challenging consequences. So extending this, everyone has their own view of what their address is, which can change over time depending on life events or scenarios which present themselves. I'd argue that most businesses have been pretty bad at enforcing any kind of rules with their customers when it comes to addressing. It's really a case of whatever the customer says or types into their web form goes in terms of identifying addresses. However, we're starting to see some basic address verification tools on popular e-commerce sites these days, which are usually based around postcodes or postal information as a way of getting people used to these new addressing systems. Businesses also have the options, as do parts of government, to buy in address data from third-party suppliers. They could also create their own or have a hybrid of these scenarios. While this is great and can save them effort, as mentioned earlier, unless there's a business strategy at the enterprise level around this, it can lead to issues such as duplication of effort and increased spend. In terms of government, it's usually local authorities or municipalities who are responsible for allocating street names and property numbers, and they often rely on legislation and legal acts that can be very old. For example, in the UK, some parts of government use street naming and numbering legislation, which is nearly 200 years old. So thinking about a unified addressing system means that some changes would be welcome in this area to support its use, enforcement, adoption and maintenance. So within the public sector, outright service failure is the biggest concern of badly managed addresses. And there have been many examples focusing around social inclusion, where missing addresses results in missing people from systems that support governmental service provision to them. Sometimes there are catastrophic consequences which result in this. So not being able to make the important link between people and place is often a powerful driver for a unified addressing system. I guess the good news is that some businesses and governments around the world are now getting savvy to the benefits of accurate and well-maintained address data. And this is certainly true for businesses that need to use geography and location for customer delivery. So examples would be logistics companies, utilities, financial services, and retailers. I found some research undertaken as long ago as 2009 from a project called Ordnance, which indicated that 94% of the businesses asked at the time deemed addresses important or business critical, with some stating that if there was no address, they couldn't do any business with that particular organisation or customer. And all of those respondents claimed that inaccuracies in addresses were causing difficulties for their business, with the main issues identified being customer dissatisfaction with their service or their inability to provide a service, duplicated effort, and loss of revenue from resulting from inaccurate, missing, ambiguous, or out-of-date address information. Around 72% of those businesses identified that poor addressing had cost their business money, with half of those people indicating that this accounted for more than 1% of their turnover. If you're a global player, that's a huge amount of money wasted on bad addressing. So clearly, moving on from that research, 8 years on, businesses are still faced with these issues, and those operating e-commerce platforms serving global customer bases, these problems manifest themselves in different ways and now require more complex data management solutions. So a good address management strategy makes it easier to understand and integrate the differences between postal, geographic, vanity, and other types of addresses which are sometimes forced into systems which people create. So addresses here, really, I've given some examples of common types that need to be brought together across business and governmental use cases as part of an enterprise level approach. I guess they're pretty self-explanatory, but sometimes people don't realise the scale of the systems that hold address information, which would be better served through the use of a single authoritative list. So what does good addressing look like? Well, I guess this really depends on your use cases for addresses, but most but mostly it will be an easy to understand system that allows everyone to find each other via existing networks, systems, and transport infrastructure. And that could be roads, tracks, rail, water, air, I guess now connected devices. To serve these needs, addresses really can exist at different levels of use and range from continent down to individual rooms, and for a long time, a hierarchical approach seems to have worked best for all these kind of use cases. I guess the best example would be maybe a global shipping organisation would need to understand addresses at the continent level, country, regional level when organising shipment of goods internationally, and then the local couriers looking after the last mile delivery would need to access local area, street and property unit addresses in order to coordinate and plan those delivery routes. So the hierarchical approach makes some kind of sense when looking at all these kind of systems. Arguably, these textual hierarchical addressing systems that are stored in databases are now supplemented with GPS, other geospatial information, and digital IDs about the address location to facilitate machine-to-machine communication. And system integration is important, but really the human element of the service chain still needs to make sense of that address in order for the system to work in the real world. There are a number of elements that make up a good addressing system, and whilst all countries have their own cultures, language, and historic practices, understanding and recognising address is really a common requirement that enables social, governmental, and economic interaction with citizens. Countries that have well-established addressing systems have integrated really the long-standing physical portrayal aspects of street naming and numbering into a national spatial data infrastructure. These SDIs allow the organisations that maintain address data and those organisations and citizens that consume address data to participate in and benefit from a wide range of digital services. And they use that address information as the key to unlocking and linking other information. I guess I'd say that generally there's a widespread recognition and comprehension of the physical aspects of addresses. For example, the signage of roads, street names and building names or numbers and how they relate to the real world in terms of logical sequences and relationships between the elements, as well as how the real world change is reflected in the address lifecycle. But this really is around when buildings are merged, subdivided, converted to a different use or demolished. This needs to be quickly reflected in the addressing system. I guess some other common attributes which are important for discussion here in a good addressing system would include identifying the most appropriate data owners that either have a statutory or a mandate, sometimes called a public task, to maintain address data. And these need to be identified and tasked with this responsibility. I guess it's a case of good master data management to ensure that the systems work. For the majority of developed nations, this is usually a local authority or municipality or maybe a national postal operator. Adoption of conventions that are universal within the territory of use of the addressing system is vital to ensure that they can accommodate local customs, maybe they can support multiple languages of addressing, and also cope with differences between urban and rural addressing. Addresses should be, in my view, componentized and rendered in hierarchical form so that you can create different types of address output to meet different demands from an addressing system. Addresses need to exist and operate at various levels, usually down to a sub-premise level in its most granular form, really to support all the types of use cases that are needed within organisations and government. These systems also need to integrate what's already there. In many cases, there needs to be integration of the postal code or the postal addressing system into a wider addressing structure. A lot of systems out there are based on PO box addressing, and we may have some limitations in developing systems around that because service delivery usually falls outside of PO box locations. Addresses really need to utilise well-known and described local area names as part of the address to provide the right context for non-digital users. And the provision of uniqueness of addressing at a local level is really important. So, for example, ensuring that the use of address IDs is paramount, and ensuring that there aren't any duplicated road or building names within a close proximity. I guess adoption of common geographic address data standards, so ISO or CEN standards, to facilitate interoperability would provide a means of providing a framework to give you data assurance and some quality framework. It would also allow you to ensure that access to address information is simplified for people that need them and need to share it across border. Street and property nameplates should reflect the official addresses that are held on a digital system and vice versa. Quite commonly, these two systems differ, and we need to make sure that they do match up. The last two things, which I think are really important, are around having a feedback mechanism for users of addressing systems to notify those data owners of addresses of errors and omissions. Without that, the system tends to falter and lose its quality stamp. And a system that's regularly maintained to reflect real-world change is one that has a quality management system. So I've included this slide just to point out really that any addressing system needs to be able to identify quality issues quickly and have processes in place to remedy them. So this example shows by a simple GIS where an address was incorrectly positioned, which resulted in a multi-million-pound insurance claim following a flood where the wrong building was actually insured, and you can see the difference in location between those two addresses. There are quite a few case studies which we can maybe pick up through a Q&A later. So what are the benefits of a good addressing system? Well, there are quite a few. We've got many case studies which those of you that go to the GeoPlace website would be able to find. But really they range from efficiency savings right through to security measures which can be obtained through a good addressing system. But some of the important ones I'd like to pick out are these. So the adoption of universal standards is important and allows that interoperability at different geographies and facilitates data sharing and aggregation of data at international levels. This is growing in importance in developing e-commerce, trade and statistical platforms where organisations and governments can share and analyse data captured to the same data specifications. There are a number of data and physical addressing standards that already exist, and some have been widely adopted, but many are used simply as a building block to derive local profiles and provide the right context from which to create usable data models and capture their own local specifications. Probably the best example within Europe is the Inspire initiative, which created 34 themes grouped around geographic and environmental related data as a way of improving interoperability and aggregation of data across Europe. Importantly here on the addressing arena has been the development of the themes around geographic names, transport networks, buildings, addresses and administrative units, which provide a reference framework for users to develop components of addressing and put into their own implementations. I'd argue that those EU member states that had long-standing use and of application of these types of data before Inspire came about have found it easier to comply with Inspire regulations. But having said that, the harmonisation approach for each of these data models has really brought about some further enhancement to some of the existing solutions in very developed nations. So the UN's Addressing the World initiative, an Address for Everyone programme, has identified the benefits of everyone having an address. Without one, it is virtually impossible to set up a bank account, vote, receive benefits from the state, find salaried employment, and access basic provisions such as water and electricity. Similarly, a universal addressing system is critical for environmental protection and planning. It can be used to identify vulnerable communities and people and prioritise support to them during natural disasters, severe weather events, or other unplanned events. And those of you that have been taking stock of what's been going on in London over the last two weeks with the tower block fire clearly presents itself with a challenge for having good addressing. For both businesses and governmental users, the provisioning of e-service platforms is really facilitated as a way of driving down and reducing face-to-face customer contact and moving towards a self-service model. Simple online verification of customers can be achieved through the use of address IDs linked to names and addresses. So within the UK, there are quite a few case studies from local government where, as a result of introducing a common addressing system, this has identified previously missed property taxation revenue, improved refuse collection services through reducing missed waste bin collections. They've delivered route optimisation for school pupil transportation, winter road gritting routes, and reduced greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions as a result of fewer buses, lorries, and waste collection vehicles being on the road. And then finally, within the commercial sector, the use of definitive, accurate, and well-maintained unified addressing systems has been shown to improve customer onboarding by telephone and web-based processes, as those businesses have been able to have better access to address data to undertake on-the-fly analysis of customer profiles based on accurate address information. I guess the best examples here are in the insurance sector, where brokers can immediately identify property insurance risks based on accurate spatial addressing information. So there are just a few of some of the benefits. There are a multitude of others which I don't have time to go through today. So implementing an address system can be daunting, particularly at national level. There are so many things to think about. So some tips really I'd like to include here are, firstly, having a common set of rules for how street and property addresses are captured is vital of any is a vital part of any addressing system. These rules should be universally adopted by all data owners that are officially recognised as managing this data. Strong and tailored communications, the need for good addressing is also pivotal to ensure that these rules are adhered to by both those responsible for creating and managing addresses, but more importantly also by those that need to access and use that address information. So good governance really is paramount to this, and there's strong evidence internationally to show that with a recognised organisational approach or governmental body owning an addressing system and showing strong leadership over those benefits to both businesses and citizens, the economy benefits through widespread usage and adoption. Without such recognised policy that is common and enforced across the country, there is quite a major risk that other address systems will gradually develop out of a business driver need, either within the public or private sector, or personal or a community requirement. And whilst technology can play a part here in providing solutions to effectively make different addressing systems talk to each other, over time this can really lead to problems longer term, which will be difficult to fix. So a common way to kickstart any implementation is to identify those what we call killer applications that the unified addressing system will benefit most. These are usually high-profile transformation projects, either in the public or private sector, that really need to use an address to make it successful. So some good examples here would be national identity cards and their rollout, electronic payment and banking systems, which need to verify people against location to combat fraud, online property and land planning portals, electronic census programs, and land registration. All these systems have been shown to benefit from having an accurate and well-managed addressing system. The final few points really are around as we go to the future. Addressing systems really are becoming more digital in their consumption. And new digital-only address systems are gaining momentum. There's quite a few of these emerging these days. And learning how to bridge the digital addresses to the physical addresses is important in a world where we still have humans fulfilling elements of service delivery and where there are gaps in technology take-up and availability. For example, we can't always find a GPS signal, or we don't always have mobile or coverage or Wi-Fi availability. Ultimately, all addresses are a means of translating a point in space to a navigational instruction. So however the textual Hierarchical address can be understood by both machines and humans. Some digital-only addresses will struggle really without a smartphone or other type of connected device. So I think digital-only and physical addressing can work well in parallel, but any user, governmental or commercial, really needs to clearly identify and mitigate the risks of going purely digital, because it may not suit all their needs. My last point on implementation is that maintenance is key to it all. Many people have got away with taking a snapshot of data from a supplier or system and then not updating it. We've all used Google, Apple, or Bing Maps and often taken it for granted that the data is regularly refreshed. I'm sure most people listening to this webinar know that this is not the case, and that things in the real world, like addresses, do change every day. So we need to ensure that you have a process in place to monitor, capture, validate, and publish these changes dynamically or every day to make the addressing system viable. Users relying on addressing for critical infrastructure such as emergency services, maybe welfare provision or financial transactions, will need to know that the data is up to date. So, to sum this up, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that addresses are often taken for granted, and people often just think they need them to identify where they live or work. Addressing systems really around the world are very diverse and not always easy for everyone to understand, particularly for visitors to a new territory who are used to their own system, which differs from the one they're now confronted with. So with the rise of digital in our everyday world, a unified addressing system is fundamental to governmental, economic and social integration platforms, and machine-readable addresses are really the key to making these systems work well. So I'm now going to open up the webinar to some questions. Thank you for listening. So I've just had a question through about accessing address information if no standard data is available, which is an interesting question. It begs the question, then is there anyone that's been tasked with creating an addressing system already? I think rather than starting in developing a system in parallel, find out what's going on both at a national and regional level and see how you can integrate with that rather than starting to create your own. You may find that you can create your own, but trying to find out what IDs are available and what kind of standards that have been used will be important in terms of moving that forward. So I've been asked to redefine what I mean by a killer application. Maybe it's just a term we use here in the UK. But essentially, these are big applications which are important to either government or organisations that are big enough that have a large proportion of the population that need to or want to use them. So in the UK, a lot of people want to do a lot of their interaction with government online. They want to pay their taxes online, or they want to do some transactions online. And if the government is promoting those kind of activities for moving everyone to digital services, then having addressing at the back end of those systems is important to their success. So I've had an interesting question here about in developing countries where there's no addressing system whatsoever, where do you start? Well, it's likely that there will be something there that's been used. It's just something that hasn't been put into a database or it's been developed further and outside of its local usage. So there are ways to start that project, and I could spend quite a long time discussing that. So what I can do is respond to this particular question more fully. But generally speaking, there are local people that want to use addressing systems. They tend to resist the introduction of new systems. So a harmonised approach in terms of bringing those people with you engaging with them, understanding how they use their existing systems, and integrating that into any new system is a really important place to start, rather than helicoptering in and saying, this is your new address, which can often kill the conversation at the outset in terms of getting people using an addressing system. I think the final question I've just come in is around understanding the importance of addressing and getting buy-in at executive level around the importance of it. I agree, it's hugely important to ensure you have senior stakeholder engagement. Addressing has always been seen as something that's easy, something that just exists, and people don't understand the processes often that go on to make sure that it is good and well maintained. So certainly we spent a lot of time in the projects we've been involved in engaging with all sorts of stakeholders, from the people that are responsible for maintaining it, so the data owners, the data stewards, all the way up to their managers, their senior managers, their chief executives. And in the case of national addressing projects, then the political input is vital in terms of gaining security of the project, and ensuring also that it transcends any kind of political change or change in government through new elections. The addressing system is something that needs to be continuous rather than just a political vote winner.